We just told the story of Corwin Brown's family. So Corwin was Michigan captain 92, 8 years in the NFL, 10 years in coaching, including D coordinator at Notre Dame, worked for Bill Belichick as D-backs coach, and at 40 was actually diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia and bipolar issues. Likely has to do with the brain injuries he suffered and or the progression of CTE. In my opinion, we don't have great data on this, but again, 40-year-old schizophrenia is not a common thing. We see CTE so common in someone who's had that many years of football. It's almost guaranteed he has it. So his kids came to us about 9 months ago to say, hey, our dad's CTE has affected our life. When they were 9, 11, and 13, Corwin took his wife hostage. He got a gun. Police standoff. He tried to take his own life. He survived. The family fought for him to stay together. They said the brain injury is not him. He was the best. They still are fighting to have their dad get better, but it's affected their mental health. It's affected their family-related dynamics in a big way.
Welcome to the Gallery and Hurley Unfiltered podcast, Iowa Football Rewind.
Subscribe now on YouTube or your favorite podcast player to get a behind-the-scenes look that you won't find anywhere else.
Today we have Dr. Christopher Nowinski, the CEO and founder of the Concussion Legacy Foundation. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
First, why don't you walk us through your journey into brain health and where you started? You were at Harvard and then had a sidebar with wrestling. Why don't you get into that for us?
Yeah, did not ever plan to be a neuroscientist. So I grew up in Illinois, got recruited to play football at Harvard, had a great time as a D lineman, and then got bored in a consulting job with life sciences. And so I just threw my hat into the pro wrestling ring and had a great time on Monday Night Raw in 2002, 2003, before I got kicked in the head too hard too many times and developed post-concussion syndrome back in 2003. And as I was trying to get better, and trying to figure out why am I headed all the time and why just suddenly I was the guy who couldn't bounce back from this concussion. I ran into the right doctors, helped me appreciate that part of the problem was I'd been getting my concussions my whole life and never took a day off because it was never enough to stop me from playing, as we all did. As long as as your vision clears up, just go back in there. I had a 10-year headache. And after a year of that, I decided I wouldn't go back to wrestling. But I also was very bothered by the idea that the next guy would be sent to the same problem unless we changed the culture. And it seemed like an easy change to me back then. Of course, all of us, we want to be tough, but we also know we don't go in there and play on a broken ankle, knowing it's not going to get better unless you rest it. We do the same thing for a brain. So I took a stab at trying to change that culture. Wrote a book called Head Games Football's Concussion Crisis in 2006, uncovered that I think the NFL was playing a role of big tobacco and bearing it all. Also dug into CTE and a chapter on that in the book and realized that CTE was probably going to be the way to change the concussion culture because we could see it, and started just this fight to take one try at changing everything. And then it kept getting bigger and bigger, realizing what CTE really was. So I started the Concussion Legacy Foundation, started the Boston University CTE Center with a bunch of great scientists there, then went back to school and got my PhD. And I've just been trying to fight ever since. And it's amazing how much progress we've made, but we've also uncovered we have a huge problem to solve.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that journey. We also are in that fight with you, I think, to change the culture and kind of change that mindset. So why don't we just jump into what's going on right now in current studies? There's a new study that you wanted to introduce and how we can help with that part of it.
Speaking to, assuming there's a lot of ex-athletes, football guys on this, basically the idea is for guys that are around our age, we're starting to lose some of us. Like my college roommate, Chris Heitzman, did 3 years in the NFL. He drank himself to death. I had a stage 2 CT, and it's the only thing that I can conceive of as to I went from the best of us and the guy we voted for as captain to the guy who left 4 kids behind and wasn't really there for them. First, I want to say if you are struggling or you're changing and you feel like it could be related to those head impacts or mental health issues, neurobehavioral issues, addiction issues, cognitive problems, do reach out to the Concussion Legacy Foundation helpline, clfhelpline.org. And I have 5 full-time people just taking inbound. I'm concerned, what do I do? And helping guide people through this over months and years to try to take care of yourself. Because on the big picture, there is hope. If you are struggling, treatment does work, especially that midlife pre-nursing home dementia stuff. People do get better. But we also need to cure this thing. CTE is a degenerative brain disease where you basically, as a teenager or 20-something, when you get it from these too many hits to the head that are causing microscopic lesions and inflammation around blood vessels that just spreads even after you stop getting hit. We don't know how to diagnose that in living people. We don't know how to stop it. And so we are working hard to figure out how do we differentiate, how do we find this disease in living people so that we can actually try interventions and then see if they work to slow it down or eliminate it. And so we announced a new study today called Diagnose CTE 2. You go to diagnosect.org. To learn more about it. But basically, I'm going to now be recruiting hundreds of former NFL and college football players to go do 2-day workups at 5 different sites around the country to help us figure out what this looks like using the most advanced scans, the most advanced blood tests, basically every cognitive test you can imagine, throw everything at it that we know about now and see if we can figure this thing out. And if you are interested in trying to be part of the solution, whether or not you have symptoms, diagnosect.org, more than welcome, or go to the concussionfoundation.org, sign up for a registry because there's 5 studies I'm recruiting for right now because we need to get a bunch of shots on goal to dip into another sport to try to figure this thing out.
That sounds great. We can link to some of those things and help our audience find those if they need. As we're talking about that, we have friends who have kids that are playing, and how can they approach the CTE as a long-term mentality, and what are they able to do now that's an ability to slow this thing down? Is there anything that you can speak to in that part?
Yeah. And so I'm just going to assume in this conversation, like everyone understands concussions. Everyone understands pulling their kids out when they see signs, making sure they're cleared by doctor. That's regulated. And that's a good problem that we've mostly figured out and at least taken care of the big issues. Although, again, concussions, even when they're properly diagnosed and managed, can still be very difficult. And that's what the helpline's for. The CT issue, people are scared to talk about prevention. They don't realize that it's a choice. Like I'm actually starting to just use the term pediatric acquired CTE because that's what it is for most people. And we had a great study published in 2023 looking at 650 some brains of football players and trying to figure out who got it and who didn't and why. And the number one indicator was not number of concussions, number of diagnosed concussions, number of concussions they think they had. It was just the number and strength of head impacts that we can project these individuals would have had over their career based on the positions they played at each level of football, including the ones played both ways and all that stuff. But basically, what it taught us is that CT is a math problem. It's number and strength of head impacts. And the way we used to play, where some people have been recorded taking 2,000 hits to the head in a season when they're playing both ways and have practices that are too much hitting. If you hit somebody in the head 1,000, 2,000 times a year for 20 years, very few people avoid CTE based on the brain banks we've seen thus far, right? I don't think there are a lot of healthy people who have this pathology who took 20, 30, 40,000 hits to the head. I don't mean that to be sad or anything, but we have to be realistic about this, that this is a choice. And so we're trying to work with all these sports. On one hand, trying to work with sports to get them to change how they play in practice. So I think the best example is the NFL is actually listening because the Players Association is fighting for it. So the kickoffs are different, even though we weren't really asking for that. But other than the players, that we now make it much safer. There's very little hitting in practice, if at all. All that stuff is going to reduce CT going forward in the future, but it's not going to reduce it unless it's also happening in college, high school, youth. To prevent CT, you got to change rules, get rid of as many hits as you can, and the big hits. Football, it's special teams, it's penalizing intentional hits to the head, all that stuff. We need to change how we practice. When we started this work, 70% of head impacts were happening in practice. At the NFL level, it's now like 20%, but it's still that way in college. There are no limits to how many times you can hit an athlete in the head. There are no pitch counts for head impacts. We need coaches to step up and learn how to and commit to teaching football without head impacts. Buddy Tevens did it at Dartmouth, but very few people have followed him. And then we need to talk about setting a minimum age to start hitting people in the head. We have a campaign called Stop Hitting Kids in the Head. It's one thing if we as adults wanted to go out there and put ourselves at risk for disease to make money or to get a free college education, but I don't understand why we're still doing that with 5-year-olds who are getting exposed to this disease and might get it. especially if you start young and you're good and you like it. You can't have a 20-year career unless you start before 14, right? And we're trying to encourage people to do flag as long as they can till 12 or 14 when it comes to football. And that will reduce the child's future risk of CTE without a doubt. And then we need to start talking about it and educating people. So coaches, kids, like people don't really understand concussions. They've been fed a lot of misinformation by the NFL over the years. We need to separate the idea. Like I keep meeting NFL players now who tell me, I'm not so worried about CTE. I've only had 2 diagnosed concussions. And you're like, it's not about the concussions, man. You've been getting hit in the head hundreds of times a year. You are at risk. When you tell them we've studied more than 400 NFL players and 93% of them had it, and they're usually in shock, right? It's a lot. But anyway, long story short is, if you're a parent, start your kid later, advocate for fewer hits to the head, advocate for safer practices. And then we got to keep finding ways to educate coaches and reach them so that they accept the responsibility that how they practice will influence which kids get CT and how much CT they get. And that's a hard conversation to have, but it's the truth.
Yeah, that is a hard conversation. And thank you for going there. Is the equipment part of that mix as well, of that dynamic of
Yes.
better equipment? I think I've seen some things where guys wear, they likened it to a woodpecker, right? Being able to hold blood in their head to do that. Are those things a part of that, or is that something we shouldn't really be diving into as well?
So like when we talk about CT prevention, starting later and hitting less is like number 1 and number 2. And it's probably the only thing you should talk about in the top 10. Everything beyond that is smaller. But the Q collar that you're speaking of, I don't think that's a real product that anybody should be wearing. It was sold to us based on this woodpecker idea. And it turns out that woodpeckers do get CTE, and it's not about having more blood in their head, the reason why they're not knocking themselves out. It was also sold to us that football programs at higher elevation have fewer concussions. That's not true either. That's been debunked. And it's also, it was told to us that it would prevent concussions. That hasn't happened. So now they've moved way downstream of trying to sell us that some research-based MRI tests are showing less damage. But even that has been called into question, as there was just an expose showing that they had replicated entire tables between different studies down to 3 decimal points, copy paste. There's an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education on that. I would not invest in that or expect that it's helping you. The helmets are getting better. That's the one good thing, is that like Virginia Tech 5-star rating, helpful, NFL, NFLPA have their own testing program, do get newer, better helmets. But I think you're talking about marginal gains, small reductions. The question on the Guardian cap, the most important message there is that the Guardian cap that has been purported to reduce concussions in NFL is a completely different product than the ones being sold to college and high schools. It is twice as heavy, different materials. And so there is no current evidence that the high school college product reduces concussions. And there's always the question of, the heavier you make a helmet, the worse off you are. The heavier you make a helmet, the greater rotational acceleration, which we think is the thing that's causing these lesions in the brain. So it's complicated. But I will say on the equipment side, we did just start writing down a CT prevention protocol for a college program. And when you think about equipment, part of that discussion is changing like tackling drills and blocking drills from other people to equipment, to tackling dummies, to falling on bags, to the MVP that Dartmouth created, that mobile tackling dummy. Like that makes more sense to tackle than people. The problem is it costs money, and injuring players doesn't cost money. Giving people CT doesn't cost high school, college programs money. We need to incentivize that behavior.
Yeah, I can imagine that. For someone who really wants to dig into like the science and that kind of updated thing, where's the best spot to find that, or who's the leading organization to go to on that? Because I'm sure, like you were saying, there's a lot of other information that gets out as well.
Concussion Legacy Foundation is trying to be that public-facing organization that helps educate people on what we know about CT in real time. A lot of that is based on the Boston University CTE Center's great research, although there are a lot of other people doing it now. So concussionfoundation.org, bu.edu/CTE are great places to go learn. I don't know if there's anyone actively putting out a whole lot of misinformation, but for example, there's a lot of things that are set out there that are somewhat misleading. So when we published a study saying your odds of CT going up between 15 and 30% per year each year you play football, which is what our data suggests thus far, the National Federation of High School Athletic Associations issued a statement saying, If you look at this study of high school football players, long term, they don't have any more dementia than the band. There was a study that said that still gets repeated. It's not a good study. It's relatively small. And therefore, there's no evidence that high school football causes CTE. The thing they're missing is that the football industry is trying to inappropriately compartmentalize football as youth, high school, college, pro. When in reality, if we were talking about smoking and lung cancer, we don't talk about pediatric smoking safe because we only do it for a few years. We say, how many years did you smoke? And you do pack years. And that's how we need to talk about football. Whatever we label it, youth, high school, it doesn't matter. It's how many years you play that is driving this. And the problem is it's uncapped when you start. And so the problem is the good players are the ones who truly suffer. The toughest people, the most talented people, people who love it the most are the ones who are most likely to get it. So when we say high school football doesn't cause CTE, when they say that, it's a false premise. Football causes CTE. If you only play 4 years and only in high school, hopefully your odds are very small that you'll get it. But if you started before or you go play after and you reach 5 years or more, you start to get into real CTE risk.
Thanks for walking us through that. Let's talk a little bit about where the treatments and the diagnosis and those things going forward. Is there any good stuff you can tell us on that?
Yeah, we can't diagnose CTE in living in part because no one ever tried, right? So we were the first academic center in 2008. This is an old boxer's disease, right? But people just assume, all right, you get punched in the head, you should expect this. And that's why boxing was abandoned as like a thing you put your kids into. Although I often show a video of the U.S. Naval Academy in the 1950s hosting 5-year-old boxing matches because that was a normal thing back then. It's a scary video. Every brain disease that's similar to CTE, you can also not diagnose with 100% accuracy during life, or at least you haven't been able to until very recently. So most doctors aren't going to tell you have CTE, and most doctors shouldn't because it can be a devastating diagnosis and we can't be sure. But we are getting close to, based on symptoms and based on knowing how many years you played football, differentiating those who have CTE versus other diseases. We'll first have a diagnostic criteria at some point based on your symptoms, and then usually in older people, probably 50 and above. And eventually we'll have a biomarker, like a blood protein that you can pull out, basically that like when your brain's rotting, your brain gets in your blood and we can pick it up. Hopefully we're going to figure out that unique signature for that disease. Who knows how long it'll take. We did just start a study called Bank CTE. Go to bankct.org and go get blood drawn at a local Quest lab and donate your brain down the road to help us figure that out. Because we can diagnose Alzheimer's through the blood with very high accuracy now. And we just have to follow that playbook to figure it out for CTE. So that's on the diagnostic side. And then the treatment side, I think of it as 3 phases. If you're young, 20s, 30s, retired, and you're having cognitive problems, sleep issues, mental health problems, all that, sometimes that gets labeled as potential CTE, but in most cases at that stage, CTE is affecting such small parts of your brain that small chance of CTE, but it very well could be all the hits to the head that gave you CTE are also causing a dozen other changes in your brain that are measurable postmortem. So basically we try to treat those as concussion cases, like long-term concussion cases, brain injury cases, and people respond very well to that treatment. And so when you're young, don't think I have CTE and therefore I'm going to fall off a cliff. The average CTE case is not Junior Seau and people dying in their 40s. It is Nick Bonicani, who was crushing business till he was 70. And then he had a very difficult last decade. The majority of the cases we see are people who are doing great until 60s, 70s. At least I wouldn't say great, but they got their stuff handled. They're able to work. But the behavioral components can be rough. The midlife group, it's usually behavioral. It's behavioral regulation and some cognitive stuff, executive functioning. Treatment does work for that too. Sleep can get messed up. If you're 40 and you think you're losing your mind because you can't think straight, I would say more than half the time when I talk to someone, they also aren't sleeping because CTE and brain injury can affect your sleep. When you get the sleep fixed, you bounce back. So people do get better. It's not probably the CTE driving that. So midlife, absolutely go to our helpline. We will find you the best local doctor who understands this stuff and you will get better. And then when we face 60s, 70s, when we have that progressive cognitive decline, we don't know how to pull out of that yet. There are some drugs that help a little bit. Your family needs to know, they need to understand what's happening to protect you, protect assets, protect the family, stay together and realize it's not just you not caring anymore. But that is a complicated thing that we need to really marshal more forces against, which is why like volunteering for the Diagnosed CTE study or something is a great way to contribute towards those better answers. So we might have an effective treatment sooner rather than later.
I think to finish up, I know you have great resources on your website, but maybe talk a little bit about the family side, what people can look for in their loved ones that have been in contact sports, how to manage those symptoms, and in real time, how to deal with that if someone notices, oh, hey, I know my spouse is struggling, and what's that going to look like?
Yeah, that's tough. So there's sort of two ways to look at it. I'll start with the kids aspect because we just told the story of Corwin Brown's family. So Corwin was Michigan captain 92, 8 years in the NFL, 10 years in coaching, including D coordinator at Notre Dame, worked for Bill Belichick as D-backs coach, and at 40 was actually diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia and bipolar issues. Likely has to do with the brain injuries he suffered and or the progression of CTE. In my opinion, we don't have great data on this, but again, 40-year-old schizophrenia is not a common thing. We see CTE so common in someone who's had that many years of football. It's almost guaranteed he has it. So his kids came to us about 9 months ago to say, hey, our dad's CTE has affected our life. When they were 9, 11, and 13, Corwin took his wife hostage. He got a gun. Police standoff. He tried to take his own life. He survived. The family fought for him to stay together. They said the brain injury is not him. He was the best. So they told their story to the Washington Post, and we did a video that Bob Costas voiced over that hopefully you can share, that just talks about how they have been dealing with this their whole life. They still are fighting to have their dad get better, but it's affected their mental health. It's affected their family-related dynamics in a big way. I say that to say we all have to pay attention to the kids in these situations, because some people who have developed not just the paranoid schizophrenia, bipolar, but even just the behavioral dysregulation, violence, aggression is a big issue. We need to take care of kids and protect them from this and really work together on that issue. But the kids aren't going to be the one that's helping dad. It is going to come down to like spouses and often parents when spouses leave or there are no spouses. And in those situations, we do a lot of great videos on our YouTube page where we talk to psychiatrists and things about how to manage. The most common thing we'll hear is that they're short-tempered, angry, and impulsive and mean, but then they'll lash out, and then 5 minutes later, they've forgotten about it. It doesn't affect them, but the family's still reeling from that outburst. Go to Dr. David Reese and some others on our YouTube page. We can find it directly to hear like how you manage that. Bob Stern talks about it too. How do you manage somebody in these situations so that you can have the best possible outcome? Because he's not lashing out because he doesn't like you. He's not lashing out because his character is worse. He's lashing out because the connections in his brain are different. And then on the cognitive side, this story is public. One of my staff members, her father was a captain of the Chicago Bears, and she's told the story publicly about how in his 50s, 60s, he started making very bad business decisions, started not understanding risk. Dave Duerson did that as well, where they ended up losing all their money. And so there's other aspects about that where you got to protect the family finances, assets, jobs, because executive function goes before memory. Frontal lobe changes. And so people start making poor decisions, poor judgment, poor planning. And so we do have a lot of videos talking to experts about how do you look for these things and manage these things. And then our helpline, you just reach out to the helpline, we'll find the videos for you to help you navigate your specific issues. It's not that these guys are broken. It's not that they're worse. It's just that this is a real disease and it does change behaviors. What we do find, and I'll say it right now, like the families that stay together have the best outcomes. But when things are too rough or the symptoms are misinterpreted, not understood as organic brain disease, and people leave, that's when you hear about some of these sadder stories. Because on their own, these people can't take care of themselves often. They stop exercising, they drink too much, whatever it is, and things spiral. And I don't say that to be sad. I just say that so we can recognize it and help these people. We've tried. We have a lot of success. We had some failures. I was not able to marshal the forces to help my old college roommate prevent his death from alcoholism, but we got to keep learning from this. We're really trying to activate alumni groups around this. So one of the things we do is the Race to End CTE. Every spring, we honor those we've lost. I just put out a graphic. We now have 16 Notre Dame players with this. We have 10 Michigan State players. We have 12 USC players that have all been diagnosed, and their names are public. And we honor them, but we also do that to raise awareness of the helplines we've created, some of which are branded to those universities that the alumni are sharing. to say, hey, here's all the ambassadors that are involved with the organization. You can trust us, reach out for help, keep pushing this out there to each other so we can find guys and intervene earlier rather than later when it's too late. And then a lot of them are raising money as well to help us keep the research going and these awareness programs and the helpline. We actually don't have an Iowa team, so maybe we should talk about that. So we do have the Tyler Sashes and others from Iowa. We've lost them, and we do love our Big Ten guys. As an Illinois guy, I grew up, my dad worked in the food service at Northwestern. I do hope the Big Ten guys take a larger role in this because great alumni groups, and we got something in front of us that we can change.
Football's such a great sport, and there's a lot of things that are wonderful about it. And then giving people resources, and this is great. I think being involved firsthand in this, I have a brother who's afflicted with it. Trying to get him to understand that he was sick was a hard thing. I'm a little sad and I'm doing these things. And I'm like, no, this is like heart disease. This is like cancer. This is your brain. That just, people don't resonate with that kind of message of, you're sick, but you can't see it. It's not this outward thing that says I have this disease that someone would know or understand. And you're sort that out through their actions and different stuff like that. We really appreciate you coming on. Thanks a lot for all the work you do and continue to push this forward. So let us know if we can be helpful in any other way.
I appreciate it. Thanks for getting the word out to your boys.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Guys. Yeah, no, I appreciate it.
Mom, Dad, let's talk about tackle football. I just learned about CTE, the brain disease caused by repeated hits to the head. The more years I play, the more I'm at risk. If you put me in tackle today...
By the time I'm a senior in high school, I'll have played 13 years of tackle football. I could already have CTE, and it will continue to destroy my brain even after I stop playing. So by the time I'm your age...
I could be fighting depression, struggling to keep my thoughts straight. I could become violent, even towards my own children. When I'm your age, what will matter to me is not my youth football career, but that, like you, I'm a great parent and I can provide for my family.
So please, keep me out of tackle football until I'm 14.
Please join us for the follow-up conversation from Dr. Nowinski's episode. So that was intense.
Yeah. It's like they got to be able to figure this out while people are alive. Yep.
It's like everything, right? It's like public sentiment, it's
Funding.
dollars.
Yeah.
It's all that stuff of what's important, right? Is it important for people to figure that out? And I think if people aren't talking about it, then it's easier to be like, okay, whoops, that guy passed away, and that guy passed away, and no one's like, this is really what happens.
Yeah.
There's not the push behind it, I don't think. And even players. There's ex-players that are just kind of, the game's changed and everybody's soft, and you're just like, okay. Yeah. It's a mentality, it's a culture, it's all those things. I've wrestled a lot with this topic and how to approach it, how to deal with it, how to think about it. People always ask me if I'd let my kid play football. And my answer has always been, it's a hard question to answer for me. Because I think I've gotten a lot from the game. I've gotten a lot of friendships, experiences, life lessons, habits, a lot of positive. So it's hard to say that shouldn't happen in a certain way. I think also I would have a conversation with my kid and I would say, go talk to your Uncle Robert. And this is your decision. You decide what you want to do with your life. You decide how you want to live your life. And if it's worth that to you, then you have to make that decision. But get information from people who have this and have dealt with it. So I think that's a part of the conversation that I have. And it would be hard to say, yeah, I know you can't do this. I think people do all sorts of things. We were talking earlier about the military, soccer, or other sports like snowboarding, X Games, those type of things, that people are doing the same thing, right? They're putting themselves in danger in that part. What are your thoughts?
Every time this comes up, I just feel fortunate that I was kicker. I didn't take hardly any hits. So it was almost a little bit of guilt that my teammates sacrificed more in that respect of putting themselves at more risk, not only just injuries, potentially long-term brain injuries. So just always feel fortunate. So for me, because of that position, it wasn't a debate. But to your point, can you get those same experiences in a way that isn't as dangerous? I think you can. There are other sports that people can play and participate in that can give you those same valuable lessons, that experience, that don't have as much risk there. And I think his conversations around how to make the game safer, that can dramatically cut down the number of times people are exposed to hits in practice and in games, and maybe with equipment modifications and rules, that can really reduce the chance. But it's never going to go away the way football is set up. And it is a great sport, but it needs to be updated and it needs to be changed. And there are changes being made, which is great. Is it enough? I don't know. But it sounds like there's a lot of opportunity still at the college level. So for a high school kid who might be considering that, a couple years seems like the risks are lower. But once you start going to that college level, to be honest, I don't know if I was a high school kid, if I would have had that conversation with an uncle or someone to say, should I keep playing football? Maybe that was back in the day, like 30 some years ago, that it was a no-brainer, wasn't even a conversation. But nowadays, if I was coming along, going into high school, would I be mature enough to have a conversation with someone and say, should I even play this game? I don't know if I would. Going into college, I think now you're saying I'm going to put 4 or 5 more years and really put higher risk on this. But there are scholarships and maybe now NIL and all this other stuff wrapped up that it makes it hard to say no. It's a much different conversation these days. Maybe harder to say no because of more incentives, more publicity, more exposure, more celebrity status than it used to be.
Yeah, there's a lot of upside, I think, that kind of weigh against that, for sure. I'm not sure that I knew of the risk back then. I assumed that we were hitting each other and we were physically, and the rest of the body, I think I assumed that was going to happen. It like saw that part of it, but I don't know if the helmet gives you this unrealistic barrier or unrealistic kind of, what's the right word to use? I guess like invincibility, maybe, that you have these pads and you have these things, you're like, oh, I can go run really fast into someone and hit them head on. And that takes away all the risk of it.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about that in rugby, you don't have helmets. And back in the day, it was leather helmets. I wonder if there were less cases because people had to be smarter. You couldn't use your helmet as a weapon. You would feel it. And so you had to do a better job at form tackling and more tackling around the ankles and thighs and less going to upper body. It seemed like maybe the way people tackled has changed as the development of the helmet has progressed, and maybe going back to something less protective would actually be safer, which is counterintuitive, but makes a lot of sense. If you can look at the data that looks at rugby versus football, similar type of sport, I think Australian rules football would also be another one to look at. Do they suffer less concussions because of the lack of a helmet? I think it's worth looking into.
So pull back on the safety measures, and that theoretically, I guess people get hurt probably more physically otherwise, maybe. Yeah, that's an interesting thought process.
Yeah, to that point, if you hit heads accidentally, the damage could be worse, but maybe the overall risk is lower from the small collisions that happen because I have a helmet, because it's protecting me, or I think it's protecting me. I have to play differently and smarter. Yeah, I think that's something I'd heard over the years, that kind of thinking about why it's gotten worse, and has something to do with this, having this helmet that gave us an idea that we were protected. When I was growing up, it was like, yeah, you might get a concussion, but you just shake it off. And there wasn't this thought, I think, around long-term damage. It was just like, shake it off till you feel better. And that's just part of the game, and be tough and respond. I don't think we really did understand that risk that could stay with you long-term.
Yeah, I think there's the hurt versus injured part too, right? It's celebrated when people come out injured and play hurt and those kind of things. I think there's a whole macho sort of aspect to that's maybe expected by the fans and the coaches and your teammates, of just sucking it up if you're not 100% and continuing to go back in. There's that mentality, I guess, that's interesting. Back to your other point about the padding and those things, I think the hard part is the athleticism, the force and the mass that is generated is incredible these days, right? It's
Way
just
too-
way
even
different.
20 years ago.
You've got guys that are 350 pounds that can move.
Run a 4.6, 4.8. Yeah,
Yeah, just like
incredible.
can
30
flop.
inch vertical, like insane. And that coming at you full force, like that's just bigger vehicle making contact. So that definitely has something to do with it too. Even going back to the 70s, you look at the old media guides and rosters and you see the size of players then and now, and it's a huge difference.
I would have been a center back then.
Right.
The linemen were 250, 265 pounds. It's like funny to think about, right? So
Yeah.
Billy Reardon could have been great back then. It's hard to get my head around it, I guess, to a certain degree.
If it goes back to the question of football in general, is it a sport it should encourage people to do?
I mean, I'm just thinking about all the wonderful
yeah.
things that came with it, and just like how that kind of is directly opposite of the brain injury part and the debilitation of it and the effect on the families and all of those things, right? It's like a huge dichotomy of each. Of one's so amazing and does all these things, and the other's just so like devastating and tearing apart. And he talked about people leaving and that part, right? And you see why, right? Because it's like destructive behaviors, risky. It's not safe to some degree. It's hard.
Yeah, I think the not knowing the risks, and I think that's the main thing first is making sure everyone does know the risks going into it. I liked what he talked about. You're a 5-year-old kid. You are not an adult. You do not have the ability to make a choice that's in your best interest long term. When you get to 18, 20, going into college, I think that's definitely a decision point. And maybe going into college, you have to sign something that says, I understand the risks I'm taking. That was not something I don't think we ever were given or told about formally. So you are now an adult and you are now able to make this decision going forward. And at least you go into it with eyes open about it and not just ignorant of it or it's hidden from you. There's also more access to information online now than when we went to school. There wasn't the internet my first year in college. That was a couple years after that, but it would be nice to at least know what the risks were. And I think we all would have at the time made that same choice, but now maybe that choice is a little different. And to your point, was there something about football specifically that gave us experiences that we couldn't have also got in basketball or wrestling or some other sport? Was it just the sport itself, or was it something unique about football that it was above and beyond what you can get in another sport? I think that's where the NFL has made some decisions that protecting its property, because it knows if this becomes a sport that people don't want to play and watch, they're in big trouble. But if it's the right thing to do, that the sport loses some popularity, just like boxing did. I think maybe that had something to do with it. Either the other sports kind of surpassed it, or people realize, do we really want to support this if people are suffering and ruining their lives for our entertainment? I'm not sure what happened to boxing's demise, but it was the #1 sport for many years back in the day. And now it's not. So is that related to the injuries that they saw people suffering, or is it just that other sports became more entertaining?
I might have to push back a little bit on this boxing part, because I think maybe boxing was maybe a question of authenticity to some degree.
That's
Because you
true.
still have the MMAs and you have those type scenarios where people like seeing people fighting.
Yeah.
They like
Yeah,
seeing that
that's true.
action. And so
There's a
I
lot
think
of corruption or fixing going on that made people like not trust the sport. Yeah.
or seeming corruption. I don't know the ins and outs of boxing, but some of those things didn't feel authentic of, okay, these two guys are going at it and whatever's going to happen, it's going to happen. It felt a little more choreographed in that
Yeah.
part. But yeah, people still love the wrestling. People still love the MMAs, Jake Paul and those guys that are fighting. There's that thirst for combat to that sort of thing. But I guess that's health and longevity of these industries and sports are, right? Yeah, NFL's a business. And so How do they keep that business running? What's exciting? What is their kind of part in all this? I suppose it's the same for the coaches, right? It's hard for a coach, I'm sure, to see some of his older players and say, okay, you gave a lot for me. And here's the direct result of that. That's got to be a hard mind frame to get in, because I think they are a big part of molding people's lives and frameworks and habits and all these different parts of it. It's a big influence on people in their lives. And then to see that at the end of it, of here's kind of the outcome. So that's got to be a hard conversation, a hard thought, I would think, of what did I do to these people? And they gave a lot of themselves, and what's their part in it?
I think that's why NFL has gone to the flag football option too. Like even their Pro Bowl is now like a flag football game. They're seeing like the writing that they have to come up with ways to cut back on hits, and the kids are not signing up for tackle football as much. I think that's data that has come out. And so having another option that keeps football in the game, that is entertaining and fun and the most popular sport in the US, keep it in the forefront when you have these conflicting things going on with the injuries. So do they transition to more of a flag football model over time to cut down on the hits and still keep the entertainment and the things people like about it? Because I think there is some options there, but I think that's why they're throwing a lot at their flag football programs for youth. And maybe that's their kind of backup plan if the injuries become too much of a thing, or they can't come up with a safe way to protect people. There's lawsuits, I'm sure, that are pending or already enforced. It's going to hurt them financially if they're saying we neglected to tell people about risks. It's just like if you worked at a company and they didn't tell you were exposed to chemicals or hazards in the workplace, and they come back and say, I'm going to sue you for not telling me and disclosing this information. You put me in a situation and you didn't tell me about the risks, and I didn't sign up for this. They can't hide that, and they have to disclose that information, or they're going to be faced with lots of lawsuits. So financially, it's going to hurt them if they don't figure out something, if it hasn't hurt them already.
Yeah, it's probably pretty well known, right? The risk and those things. So that probably, I'm sure after that class action lawsuit, that culpability is probably passed off a little bit, right? You can't feign like you don't know anymore, right? I think. And that's probably juxtaposed to the NFL saying, we're not responsible, right? There's probably a fine line in the law there of saying, okay, this is a problem. This is what this is, but we're not the ones that are on the hook for it, which is an interesting spot to be.
It goes back to like tobacco, right? You have to put a warning label on there, and they've been sued many times, and mostly because they weren't telling people the risks. And now they have some way of doing it still, but their usage has gone down tremendously because they disclosed that, hey, this causes cancer with prolonged use. It hurts their product. And maybe they shifted to a vaping and other things to make it a little safer, but there's still risks there. But hiding the risks, I think, is always a bad idea. And it's short-term gain for these organizations and programs and industries because of the profit motive, but long-term, it's usually bad because that comes back to bite them. They don't want to deal with the short-term pain, but they did end up paying more for it in the long run because they do hide it, and you can't do that. So did they not know at the time when we were in school? I don't know. And they didn't tell us, or they really didn't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm sure there's information out there that probably was available at the time and we weren't aware of it or told about it. No, I'm saying it's done intentionally. It's just maybe it wasn't solidified yet, or there wasn't enough evidence yet.
Yeah, I think the other part of Chris's conversation too is just the data, right? I'm sure they just don't have a lot of the data. Right? They haven't been following kids from 5 years old to when they're 70, right? They're just not that subset of information. So I'm sure that's an interesting path forward for them to try to make good and scientific decisions on what they have, right? What they can collect.
And that's hard to do long-term health studies where you have to track people over decades. That's one of the more challenging things you can do and that's what I think tobacco held off a long time, is they could say, yeah, but look at all the other things they were doing. How do you know it's not that? And enough data finally came through that says, no, this is the common highest driving factor of whether you have cancer. But they could argue for decades that where you live and your job and what you ate and all these other things could be the factor that causes the cancer. Same thing with football. You could say, yeah, you played football, but you also rode your bike a lot, and you can always poke holes in theories and delay things with more questions and more, what about this? Until enough data gets compiled over those long periods of time, which could take decades to see the trends or patterns. So even if you look back at the early players, they talked about Mike Webster and some of these other guys, they didn't have data from when they started playing. And when it's not something instantaneous that this happens and then 2 months later something is measurable or noticeable, and it takes decades for it to come to fruition, then that's a very hard study to prove and get enough data on. And so unfortunately, that's probably where they're at, is, like you said, the data is really hard to gather and shows proven and very clean and scientific.
And direct causation, yeah, for
Yes.
sure.
Yes.
Afterwards, you did this thing that hurt you as well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and you can't experiment with people and say, we're going to put 2 people under the same conditions and we're going to expose this person to 10,000 hits to the head and this person to none, and we're going to measure their brain activity next year. That's not a study people are going to sign up for. And so you can't impose these kind of experiments on people to test it, direct cause and effect relationships there. So with health, it's just not ethical to do it like that. So it makes it really challenging.
For sure.
We talked about maybe we'll do something with this race for the cure and maybe try to get an Iowa team set up. And then maybe for next year, we could try to do a little fundraising and see what we can do to help that cause and get some of our players more engaged in this initiative and go from there. That's a takeaway I think I'm getting out of this.
Yeah, for sure. We'll put something together to try to raise money and to get a group for this. I think would be a great thing, and or at least see if there's interest in that. And then my brother also has Athletes for Care that he's working with closely and starting.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks everyone for
joining
us. We will be back next week. Chad Lystico next week, Des Moines Register reporter. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Go Hawks.